Hey folks, welcome to week 14 of the foundations class and the last session of class for us. You guys have a little more work ahead, but here we are with the transition out of this, out of the all these theorists that we've been reading through. You know, that a tone that I like to give in any of the MPA program or in certificates is about the reflective manager. You know, the person who thinks about what their work should look like, you know, what they've been taught that it will act like, but is it really like that? And if we had any test for that, it was in this past year. It was in this past year with regard to responding to COVID. A number of you have talked to us as a group about those odd transitions during the past year and just the challenge that we had. I really felt that if I could think, now everybody had challenges. Everybody had interesting and tough situations. But as far as I was concerned, I thought that those who were responsible for really young kids were in the biggest of challenges. And that's where I started thinking about a few different of our really great alumni working in nonprofits that serve young people along the way. So I'm really pleased to bring in two alums tonight who I had one in class. I had Chris Hunt in class a few years back. Amy O'Leary I've met through nice volunteering involvement with the MPA program. She's a very good stakeholder as an alumnus of this program over time. So I'm pleased to bring them to all of you and their knowledge and smarts and dedication and everything that we get in that nonprofit world. I'm happy to see a few of my undergrads here tonight, and you're welcome. And you know, yeah, you're just like these grad students, only you know, I'm not sure how are undergrads different than grad students. I probably shouldn't get into that, but good to have you. And so I'll tell you how we're going. I will just give you a brief bio of each of our speakers. We're going to go with Amy first, then Chris, and I'll give both bios, I think, and then let Amy take over. And they're going to introduce the year behind us, thinking about what their they can tell you a little bit about the organizations. Amy, if you want me to pull up the website or anything, I can do that too.
I have slides. I'm ready to go.
You do? After, okay. And
all I learned in my Suffolk MPA, right?
Speedy. So yeah, so they'll introduce the organization and what it was like in February of 2020. Then what the year that just passed brought their way. So the description of their specific organizations, a little difference in their focuses, and probably different in how they had to face all of this. That'll be our first 40 odd minutes of what we have ahead of us. Open for questions. These folks like to think and deliberate on what's been going on in the organization. So please be comfortable asking anything you want of them as we go. Here's what we have, and so I'm not pinning or anything. I think that once they start talking, well, I don't know. You'll see where they'll go to the top of your screen, I believe, when they are talking. So Amy O'Leary is director of Early Education for All, which is a campaign within an organization called Strategies for Children. It's been there for most of this century. Previously, she taught and was a program director at Ellis Memorial School in South Boston. She's got a lot of good networking and association effort, including right now the presidency of the National Association of Education for Young Children. She's been an adjunct professor at a couple of different colleges, and she serves on the boards for her undergraduate institution, Skidmore, out there in Saratoga, right? I think it's in Saratoga, yeah. And Children's Investment Board, a few others. She's been on the alumni advisory board for the MPA program. Was an MPA alum early in this century. How about that? Chris Hunt is the executive director of the Professional Center for Child Development, and he's had a nice line of effort and work on his way up through special education, special needs teaching and education. He held a couple of leadership positions before this job in the Community Teamwork Incorporated. When he was in the MPA program a dozen years ago, he was the professional development manager at MAPS, the Massachusetts Association of 766 approved private schools. 766 being, well, he can tell us that special needs. And I've had a long, good friendship with Chris's mom. So, you know, he's got to keep on his best behavior. Marilee Hunt was, she had some interesting state positions and is a real leader in Bridgewater, has always been a leader in Bridgewater as long as I have been around that community. You know, I feel like I'm part of her family. So Chris, that makes us brothers, and I'm happy to have it.
I apologize then.
Oh, it's all good. It's all good. Your dad is you know your dad, you know. Yeah,
My mom's great.
We'll set that aside, right? Super. Amy, let you take it away.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me tonight. Today was we had our NAYC board meeting from 11 a.m. till 5 p.m. and it was my last one as president. So it's been an honor to be president of that association. And certainly was interesting during COVID to watch kind of a statewide advocacy organization that I have my day job at, and then watch a national, you know, multi-million-dollar organization go through the past year and a half. So it's been quite a ride. So what I'll do is I'll share my snappy slides. And if you have questions, if you want to use chat, that would be great. So, and if Brendan, if you want to moderate that, but I'm sure we'll have time for that.
That's great. Yeah.
So as Brendan said, I started as a preschool teacher in the South End of Boston after I graduated undergrad. I had a psychology and early ed degree from Skidmore. Moved to Boston, started teaching in preschool, and it's a community-based organization. So infants, toddlers, preschoolers. We had a kindergarten program at the time because Boston Public Schools only had half the eligible kindergartners in the public schools. And then we had a school age program and an adult day health program. So at my time at Ellis, when I became a director, I started the Suffolk program while I was still there. And I became interested in policy and advocacy there as a director who now was in charge of enrollment, finances, you know, the whole part of running a high quality early education and care program. And my story of how I got the strategies is when I graduated from Skidmore, I connected with the alumni office, and kind of anyone that worked with children in Boston, I set up an informational interview. And one of those people was Margaret Blood, who was working for Representative Kevin Fitzgerald from Jamaica Plain at the time, the State House, had just started the Children's Legislative Caucus there. And she was an alum of Skidmore and basically kind of told me I was going to be okay, connecting me to 3 people. I got my job at Ellis, and then she became the campaign director for the Success by 6 campaign at the United Way. So I kind of followed her, and then 10 years after I had my informational interview with her, she hired me at Strategies for Children. And so I came to the work as an educator, as someone who believes in child development, and had to learn all of the policy, the politics, the legislative process, which is why I ended up going to Suffolk, because I wanted to learn more about how government worked, this inside outside strategy, which I can talk about. So this is, we were created in 2000. I joined in 2002. And Early Education for All has been our advocacy campaign. We are going through some strategic planning now, so stay tuned for that. But we work to ensure that Massachusetts invests the resources needed for children birth through age 5 to access high quality early ed programs. And these are the areas where we had worked in. As far as our organization, we have, you know, we were a founder organization. Margaret left, and we've had 2 other leaders of the organization. But as we did our work, we have been, you know, Margaret started out as 1 employee, we grew up to 9 employees, and now we're at 3 employees. And a lot of that has to do with the funding. We were funded originally under pre-K when there was a lot of energy around universal access to pre-kindergarten. But these are the areas we have worked in over the years. And when we hear early childhood, we wonder what we're talking about, and we hear a lot of these different words. So here are some things that you'll hear. I do have an ongoing debate with a with a public radio reporter who keeps calling it daycare, and I keep telling him to stop calling it daycare. But he says, well, that was what everyone calls it. I'm like, well, if you stop calling it daycare, I bet they would stop calling it. But it can be very confusing. And this is one of our challenges of constituency, because we have so many names and so many mean different things for children and family. But basically, we think about the period of time from birth through age 8. And then this is the context in Massachusetts, and this is from the 2010 census. We know the new census numbers were just released, and so we expect some of these to change, including our population, which I've heard now is closer to 7 million. But in Massachusetts, we have about 70,000 babies born a year. And then our department, we'll talk more about the governance because it's important to the story of what happened this year. But about 55,000 children receive subsidized care, which in Massachusetts means there's public assistance for families, mostly based on family income to get support from the government. We also see about almost 17% of children under the age of 6 living below the poverty line, and then 71.2% of children under the age 6 with all parents in the workforce. And this is important because this is pre-COVID, but this is also kind of this idea that if there's a 2-parent household, someone's home. That's not true. Most of our parents are working. In Massachusetts, this is what education looks like. And so Strategies for Children was work to file the bill that ultimately created the Department of Early Education and Care. So we have 3 education agencies. They each have a board. They each have a commissioner. We also have a secretary of education, and he is the governor's in the cabinet representing education, but he really has no authority over the 3 departments. And this is important because we were the first country in the nation, first state in the nation to have a consolidated, elevated Department for Early Education and Care in the country. And part of that was initially we sat between Health and Human Services and Education. And both commissioners at the time said that, early ed would never be a priority because it just did, education really was focused on later years and graduation. And human services was really care about, most vulnerable families. So as we get started over the year, one of the things that we did after the murder of George Floyd was create a collective statement on racial justice, which I'll send Brendan the link to it. We worked with 30 other organizations. But really, when you think about the work that we are doing every day, to think about how we are calling on our elected officials to think about the context that we're living in, and especially when we think about the workforce of early education and care, mostly women, mostly low paid, and how we have to change that. And this was an opportunity to take a stand around policy and advocacy, which was important for us to make a statement, and we have continued to go back to what we're advocating for over the last year, especially, but continuing as we move forward. So one of the key talking points when COVID hit, we heard a lot about how essential childcare was, except that 37% of educators in Massachusetts are eligible for some kind of public assistance. We also saw decision-making that was happening in all these different silos with no understanding of the implications for all the different parts of families. And we also saw inequities rise when we talked about testing, initially when we talked about vaccine distribution. I'll talk more about this, but we were really testing K-12 teachers, most of whom were working remotely, and we were not testing early educators who came back immediately during the crisis. And we all know that the systems that we have set up really have not worked for people, and now our eyes are wide open. We know the childcare market was broken before COVID. We had too few children who had access, too many early educators living in poverty, and too many programs one rent payment away from closing down. And we have a complex system. So when you think of a public-private system, this was part of the complexity because the solutions and policy might not be as clear-cut as they were for other parts of the sector. This is something that came to light during the last year and a half, is that most of the dollars funding for young children are coming from parents. If you can see, the orange bar since 2017 is the private pay funds. You can see the green is a little bit of federal we got in December, and then the yellow is what we got, the initial CARES Act. We have to update this from the American Rescue Package. But you can see that the public dollars that are in blue in good times are very small. And then there was more, the number shrank because parents did not send their children back to programs. But if you think about balancing a budget and you're basing your budget on full enrollment, programs were in trouble, and I'm sure Chris is going to talk about that. Here's just some highlights of our workforce. in early education and care. And then, as I said, if you see the impact of COVID, half the workforce was laid off, furloughed, or greatly reduced their hours during the closure. And so this is a little bit of what happened over the year. Governor Baker declared a state of emergency and all programs shut down. And again, that was a difference because typically, even on snow days or when the K-12 system shuts down, childcare keeps going. So this was a big deal on March 23rd that all programs had to close. You can see in March, the week before that, we set up an emergency program for essential workers. There were about 500 programs across the state that stepped up to serve first responders. If you look in June, that's when providers could begin to open, and they were able to kind of start thinking about opening. And then June, childcare programs were allowed to open. So basically, kind of from a government point of view, their licenses were suspended for that time, except if you were an emergency childcare program. What we don't see on the slide is also the kind of the school age programs who suddenly pivoted to serving full day remote learning hubs. And we saw both the state and local governments respond to how to support families do that. So what did we do? So strategies for children. We have learned a lot in working in coalition and trying to move policy. And one of our biggest enemies is misinformation, coupled with fear and anxiety, coupled with who is making decisions. So we started back in March of 2020, the 930 call. And it was first with 20 organizations just to kind of get everybody on the same page. Our invite list now is about 450 people. And we've been having the calls every day since last year. We've taken a few days off, but it really, we get about 70 to 100 people every morning. And it's kind of a quick check-in, what's going on. We also have had guest speakers, including the commissioner, including mayors, superintendents. We've had highlights from the field. And what it has done is created a community, and it's been statewide. And that's been one of the biggest benefits is we are, from Greenfield all the way to Cape Cod of people getting the same information. The commissioner has used it as a heads up opportunity. We've worked with the epidemiologist that was working. And when you go back and look at where people were and what decisions they were having to make, it was just incredible to think that people kept going on. And we've also had legislators. So one of the things that Strategies for Children has done after every election is we do a first year tour. And we typically go to the State House. We have 15-minute kind of check-ins with all the newly elected legislators. And this year we did it on the 930 call. So we had them in groups of 2 to 4 again, across the state. What was more incredible is we always had constituents on the calls, which would not have happened if we did this in real life. And it was a meet and greet. We had 100% participation, which we've also never had in the first year tours. We saw the implications, and one of the biggest challenges is back to the bar is the Attorney General started getting calls because parents were being asked to pay the tuition for their childcare programs, even when they were closed. And it was because that's the only revenue stream. So if you wanted that program to be there in 3 months, there had to be some dollars supporting it. So kind of this question of kind of new partners, we had never really worked with the Attorney General's office before. We did. We also were able to be a resource of information and kind of like our day job of collecting information, getting it out to, groups of people and helping to think about where the advocacy opportunities were, was really important at each point of the process. We did a ton of advocacy, like many of my colleagues in other areas around the federal dollars, the federal relief dollars. And our state legislature, I think because of all the work that they've done over the years, really stepped up and supported the most vulnerable families in our systems and the programs serving those families. So they paid parent fees, they kept programs whole for the subsidy dollars, and they gave a lot of policy flexibility for as programs were opening back up about how we counted whether children were there or not. We also saw women leaving the workforce. So you still can't open up any news source without some story talking about, we all saw the stories of the moms with the high chairs on either side of Zoom. We saw women leaving the workforce. We've talked to HR departments of huge corporations that are worried about all the progress we have made for women can be erased in a year. And we've also know that we've done a ton of work thinking about surveys, thinking about other ways of collecting information for families. And we saw that they didn't know if they were going to go back. It might look different than it had before. Many parents are worried about their children's health, the health of their people in their households, and then what was happening to their social and emotional development. We also know that we're not back to where we started. Right now, this is a little old data, but we've seen many closures of programs that just couldn't keep it going financially, people that were kind of toward the end of their career that said, I don't want to do this anymore. So this match of what are we going to need and then what's going to be available is something that we are still waiting to see. One of the challenges is, early in the pandemic, there was a Boston Chamber event and somebody said, well, wait a minute, if this is a driver, we should just open up childcare, which sent fear and anxiety as people were coming to work in full gowns and we didn't know how it was transmitted. And we kept saying, you can't say these kind of casual things about, oh, let's just reopen childcare without really thinking about, what's behind all that happening. And we also know that we're going to need flexible, stable dollars to make it in the new reality. And we can't continue on the system that is based on this parent pays for this spot and you can only get paid if that kid comes, because we know that parents are making different decisions now. What we have seen are increased public awareness and media coverage. So there has been, and we used to say we could write the same op-ed in 2002 and just change the date and submit it for 2021 because so many of our policies have not made progress. But this time, somebody asked me how I felt. I said, I felt seen. I felt like people were really taking the time to understand what these tensions were, why we ended up where we are. It's not fiscal mismanagement of why programs can't make it. They have been under-resourced and undervalued from the beginning. We also saw the change in the administration. We have been asking for money for childcare and now we got $50 billion. So we cannot waste this opportunity. We also have to recognize that it's kind of filling in a ton of, years of neglect. But how do we really think about this as a public good? The same way we think about other parts of education. We did see collaboration across sectors, businesses, employers, local communities stepping up. We saw flexibility in the policy and the regulations. And then, everybody was surveyed out, right? The data collection of what's happening, how long are you going to make it? We had a group of directors that developed a spreadsheet that basically said, if no relief comes, these are the days that we're going to have to close our doors. And we saw similarities to the restaurant industry, right? That has similar in some ways the business model. So the relief that has come has been so critical just for sustaining what could be, and then we have to think about how we're going to build back differently. So from a policy point of view, both through the state budget process and the last legislative session, we did see this early childhood education economic review commission that was created. It was originally part of an economic development bill. It got passed in our state budget, and it really is to review how childcare programming is funded in the Commonwealth and to make recommendations for changes. And we saw this with the K-12 funding formula in the last 5 years, where they established a joint commission to look at the funding formula, made recommendations, and ultimately passed a big bill 2 sessions ago. So we see this not as a kind of we're a commission where ideas might go to die, but really as an important vehicle to really change the way we think about funding, financing, and the business of and treating it like a public good. There's also a new coalition, Common Start Coalition, that has filed legislation around universal access to childcare. We've also been advocating in the state budget. We've seen the federal relief come down. And I would say most importantly, highlighting and learning from local bright spots. So Chris, I'm going to tell the story of Mayor Rivera and Lawrence. I don't know if I'm stealing your thunder, but there was a family child care provider who at one point had 25 children in her care, which is not okay. And in the city of Lawrence, and the mayor said, you know, we could have either, you know, punished people for being poor and having to make decisions to go to work, or we could have thought about what the community need is. And the community need was that parents had to go to forward, you know, public facing jobs, and they needed somewhere for their school age children to be. So Mayor Rivera found $400,000 in the city budget to be able to support those school age children in a remote learning hub. And it was a temporary fix. It wasn't going to solve everything, but it was an important policy decision. We also learned in places like Lawrence that had been through the gas explosion had emergency preparedness plans. So they knew who had the diapers, who could get food to families. And I will say the unintended consequence is food security is a much bigger issue than anyone ever could have imagined. And I only probably lost it publicly on Zoom a few times, and it was always hearing from these incredible warriors on the ground who were buying food and delivering food and talking down parents and doing whatever they could to support children and families. They didn't know how they were going to get paid back. They didn't know if they were going to be open next week, but the work and the idea that families don't live in these funding streams that we have created, that other significant moments really came when we talked to superintendents. And as communities were developing hybrid plans, you know, I asked a few, like, where do you think their kids are going to go on the days they're not with you? And they would say, oh, the Y or the birth. And I said, well, if it's not safe for them to all be in school, it's not safe for them all to be at the Y on Wednesday when it's cleaning day. It's also not safe for the school age staff to go into buildings that aren't safe from 8 to 2 to run remote. So a lot of the inequity and kind of the business as usual plans that we have kind of been operating under, it was an opportunity to raise up and speak out. And I think to have us as a statewide advocacy organization that can get feedback from the people who are doing the work and get it back to policymakers, and the same way get policymakers to come and hear from the people who are doing the work, really helped promote, and it really helped to us think about our mission in a little bit of a different way. And one of the questions, Brendan, that you had was about funding. And we have been downsizing because there has not been a lot of funding available for policy and advocacy. It's much more appealing to fund a program that could have outcomes that, you know, more children served or more children fed. What we saw from the funder and the philanthropic community over the last year was absolutely incredible. We were approached by funders to help us build our capacity because they saw and understood the value of having a place to come to first problem solve, you know, share resources, which includes information, have enough people to get the attention of policymakers so they weren't having to do 20 different meetings, they could just come to one call. And then to really think about how we could jointly advocate together and ask for things where I think we never would have before. So, I mean, the most overused phrase is don't waste a crisis, but you can't wait. You can't waste this opportunity. I am now officially running the We Can't Blow It campaign because we will not have this opportunity again where people are really looking for action. This has been personal for so many people. Who have lost loved ones, who people are much more interested in how government works. So we have to think about how can we develop these policies and the realities for children and families as we do build back stronger. So as we think about the forward, we still have the most expensive childcare in the United States, and that's not what people, you know, there's a gap between what the costs are and what people are actually getting paid. We want to think about this public good delivered through a private market. We want to think about making decisions in these 3 government agencies. And I think we were relieved to see that the vaccine has, you know, early ed and school age was in the same bucket as K to 12. But now we're hearing many more stories about, you know, teachers having COVID, even with the vaccine distribution. and just the realities of how we're going to continue to need testing as we kind of reopen. But that's the spiel.
That's super. Thanks so much. And just one quick thing, Amy, is so are you guys largely Massachusetts? It's the Strategies for Children is Massachusetts is the boundary for you all, or?
It is. We are part of the Alliance for Early Success, funds all 50 states, organizations like Strategies.
Yeah.
So we certainly have the benefit of learning from other states. And I would
Right.
say we have joined other states and our federal national partners to advocate in Congress.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll probably come back to that in questions. Thanks so much. And so pulling from there, we'll go with Chris, kind of, I think, really focusing on a narrower band of child, as well as regionally as well, right? So Chris, we'll let you take it away.
Yeah, so I'm going to cover this probably more from a very being a nonprofit executive and the decisions that I had to make in order to just survive during the time of the pandemic. And I can't speak enough about the advocacy work an organization like Amy's does and that other trade associations do on our behalf, because when you're an executive and you're down in the bunker, you're just trying to survive, and you need somebody to be able to go to legislators and say, stop being stupid, give them the money and let them get their job done. Right. And we can't have that when we're sitting there in crisis trying to deal with the day-to-day operations and really just not even knowing where we're going to stand at the end of the day. So I'll back up. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint here. You can see that all, I think.
Yeah, that's good.
So, these are things that you learn in grad school, PowerPoints. I'm sure you guys know how to make other more fancy things. My seventh grader shows me things on the computer now that she can do, and I'm just amazed. And then I refuse to learn them. So we're getting old school PowerPoint here. I want to back up for a second because I want to tell you a little bit more about my organization and where I'm at in it. So the Professional Center for Child Development was founded in 1973 in the basement of Christ Church. And it was founded because two nurses in their community were seeing children coming out of the institutions and being charged with, the parents were being charged with providing the care, right? And it's around the time of Chapter 766, which was the law that opened up special education services. And they said, we can help because we're nurses and we're professionals and we can do this. And so they founded the Professional Nursery in Christ Church in the basement of Andover. And the Professional Nursery was to separate themselves from the nursery that was right upstairs from them with the same age group. That later became our flagship program, which is Improved Private Special Education School. And currently today has 10 children in it. It's a very small program, and it's a very important program to me. And it's one that works with some of the most medically complex children in the Commonwealth. Right before the pandemic hit, we had a child who passed away. He was 3 years and 1 month, right? His parents' goal was to get them into school, right? And we were able to achieve that goal, even though the child's expectancy for life was about 2 years. And that's through the interventions that we have as a community, as a society, but also the hard work of my staff. And so what they do on the ground level is incredibly important. And in about 1978, we opened up one of the first early intervention programs in the state of Massachusetts. In 82, the church, there was some pieces that went on there. We went on to incorporate as our own nonprofit. So technically, we were a nonprofit from 82, but we say that we're in 48 years of existence at this point in time, and I'm looking forward to celebrating 50 in a couple of years. And throughout this time, one of those original nurses that started the program, Beryl Anderson, was at the helm, and she retired in 2016. So any of you that are looking at becoming a nonprofit executive and you're looking at taking over for somebody who's been in position for 44 years, just know that comes with a lot of baggage. It comes with a lot of opportunity, but there's a lot of stress and strain. So before the pandemic hit, I'm coming into an environment in 2017 where there was a very short interim period, right? But I'm having to deal with, I'll put it this way. I was coming out of the Head Start programs, and you really never realize how well funded Head Start is until you step out of it and you go, oh my gosh, I was sitting on my computer and this is what I needed for a computer, and my staff all had computers, and we had databases, and we had data analysis, and we could do all these things that they teach you in public administration to do, to ordering a computer before I started and then getting in there and saying, oh my gosh, this computer, which has a touch screen and all this stuff, is being ridden on it's like driving a Ferrari on a dirt road, because there's no server room. There's my email got bounced back on the very first day. I couldn't do shared calendars. I didn't know how to manage in this non-technology world. And so we set out on a path to improve our technology. But I was in a founder transition. And that's a lot of hard work to do in an organization. You can't just come in and be a bulldozer in that place, because the staff are good and they're doing honest work and they're working hard with the children, but the systems and the management structures are not exactly where you want them to go. So you got to do the change management in order to get to where you want to go. Then, as Amy actually alluded to, the gas explosions happened, right? So you're doing all this change management. I'm trying to develop the mission statement, trying to advance our program and looking at the opportunities that we have. Gas explosion happens. 3 days, 4 days after the gas explosions happens, my Lawrence site, where my early intervention program, which is my largest program, has a backup sewage main because a hurricane that came through. We had to evacuate. They had to come over to our headquarters. That's not how you want to start a tenure, right? As an executive director, but it gave opportunity. And then the pandemic hit. So, and that was right around my third year, right? And I always said, if I make it to 3 years, then I've been successful, right? Because when you take over for a founder, you have to be prepared for that type of, you might just be the interim person coming in. And the pandemic really opened up an opportunity for us as an organization, but it wasn't without a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So this is just a quick overview, of the different types of programs I just explained. We have the day school. You guys probably recognize him from TV, but that was Governor Baker that came out one of the first years to be a community guest reader. He actually came out with his wife. It was a great experience for our program. We have the early intervention program, which is one of the largest early intervention programs in the state. There's 59 different programs. We work with about 1,500 to 1,600 on a non-COVID year children per year. And that's all third-party insurance billing, right? And that's an important part of this story. I should also say the day school is all tuition-based through the cities and towns. And that's an important part of what's going on in COVID. I do consultation services. We have a regional consultation program. We give out free adaptive equipment to families. We can provide them with a resource and referral pieces. And then we have the initiative that I kind of started right before the pandemic, which is to open up a childcare program. When I arrived, we had a preschool program that was running 3 days a week, half days, more your old traditional model, not meeting the community, not supporting working families. And I pushed hard to develop the Woodbridge School. And we're actually branding it as a Woodbridge School. And so this is how the construct of the organization looked pre-pandemic. And our mission was eliminating the barriers to a child's growth and development, right? Sounds like a great mission, but it's one that I was planning on working on, because that's what you do when you come in as a new executive. You do a strategic plan, you look at the mission and say, is it focused in the right place? So those were kind of my priorities right before the pandemic hit. Launched the childcare program. Our day school enrollment was down, right? It's 10 kids at, a very hefty tuition, given the medical model that we use. And when you're down one, you're down 100K, right? So we were down to 5 kids. And so I'm trying to make the decision, are we staying open? We open it. We actually were able to get the enrollment up right before the pandemic hit. And so, okay, I could keep that open. We have this branding, naming, recognition piece, right? What the heck is the Professional Center for Child Development? First off, it's 11 syllables. The governor can come out and you're still not going to be in the headline, right? No matter how you cut it, you have a branding problem, you have an identity problem. We've been around for 48 years, but nobody knows who you are, right? Because it's associated with the founder. They knew who Vera was, but not the center. And so you're working on a lot of branding issues. Fundraising was not our strength. We were surviving on the revenue that we brought in from the programs, which is a good business model. But fundraising and nonprofit is the glue that helps you to be able to advance and move your organization forward. We were light on a strategic plan. We really needed to hone in on it and say, what do we want to be in 10 years? And how do we set the path to get there? And then the technology piece. We had gotten a couple of grants, and right before the pandemic hit, October of 2019, all my staff got brand new computers, right? That's 130 people, all brand new computers. They were paperweights. We didn't use them in the field. We didn't have use for them. They didn't know what to do with them. Like literally over the last year, I've taught people how to save documents, right? So they didn't know how to, you're going to teams. This is the reality of the field and the work that we're doing on the ground. Our early intervention program goes into the homes and works with families that might have a child that's going to be terminal, right? Might not speak, might not walk. And my staff can have those conversations and they can guide them and give them the most compassionate care you would ever believe. They might not be able to turn on a computer. Now they can, but back then they couldn't. And that's where I was like, technology, a 5-year plan, will take everybody slowly through this and we'll get them up to speed. Was not something that I expected to in March of 2020 to say, hey, guess what? You're going to build a telehealth program and you're going to be successful with it, right? They actually, right before the pandemic hit, we're trying to figure it out. I had a board meeting February, and one of my board members, he leans over to me and says, this COVID-19 thing might be a real thing. Just get prepared for it. And I said, I'm more worried about the flu and how much of an idiot do I look like and going through all this stuff. And then I talked to my staff and I said, what do you guys feel about a telehealth system? It's not really us. It's not really what we do. Right. And you get to that place where you go, I got to freeze all the programs. March 13th of 2020, I won't forget the day where I said, okay, my childcare program, I'm closing you down. Everybody's getting furloughed because I don't have any revenue coming in for you. And I have to furlough you. My day school, you're not coming into the building, but your tuition isn't cut off yet. So you get to do work, but you got to figure out how to teach children with complex medical needs through the virtual platforms that we have. Basically creating an IEP for the families to implement an IEP, right? That's not easy to do. Never mind the fact that they have lives too. They have other kids at home that they're trying to manage, right? That's a really complicated thing. So our initial focus became survive, right? That was the first thing that working with my board of directors was to do a budget and look at it and say, okay, if you have to close down everything, what do you absolutely have to pay? What is that amount of money? How much money do we have in the bank and how much runtime can we have? Right. And that's furloughing all your staff, right? And even looking at furloughing myself, right? Which these are not easy decisions to go through. We ended up furloughing 80% of the staff and workforce that we had. 80%, 130 staff, right? So one of the toughest decisions I've ever had to make and don't want to ever make it again, right? That you have to sit there and say, do it. But we did it with intention. Some of my colleagues that run early intervention programs didn't take this path. Didn't take this journey. They took some other decisions, which is probably right for their organization, but wasn't for mine. What I looked at and I said, okay, this isn't a 2-week thing, right? Let's start to plan for 6 to 9 months, and let's just pretend telehealth is never going away. How do you want to set it up, and what do you need to do? And they couldn't build the telehealth plane while flying the traditional plane and getting all the questions from staff. We had to remove the staff and give my management team. I kept on about 7 or 8 staff. And I said, you got 3 weeks. Build me a telehealth platform that worked. Every day we met. We'd wake up at 5, go to bed around 10, working to build out a telehealth platform and figuring out trainings, figuring out how you're going to do interventions. How do you set this up for success? Because in the early intervention model, you are based upon billable time. 1 hour build, right? If you're not with a client, you're not billing. Right? So that dead time is there. You have to be able to have that contact time. So you can't do a 15-minute phone call and pay your staff for an hour. It's just that the math, the economics don't work. You have to be able to do it. And there's no quality within that. So we need a quality where the parents would keep coming back to a telehealth platform and model. We needed staff that could engage in that way, and we need to be at quality. And so that's what they had to do in the first 3 weeks. And that became our sole focus in this March to June timeframe. Basically, childcare was shut down. They don't exist to me. It broke my heart. It was the initiative that we're trying to do. I couldn't do it. We weren't doing emergency care. My staff were at home. My staff would take their own personal time and call the families and do all that stuff. But I couldn't do it as an organization. We had no internal capacity to. Day school, they were figuring it out with the tuition, and they were fully, had all their staffing in place. The early intervention program needed a lot of resources put behind it. This actually is where we started tracking. So you can see, I don't know, it might be too small, but April is when we relaunched our telehealth services. And at my time, I was praying we could get back to 1/3 of our billable hours. We were billing out about 1,200 hours a week. 1,200 hours a week at almost $100 an hour. That's a lot of revenue to be generating. That first week, that's like, sorry, the chart said we were hoping to get up to 1/3 of that. We were hoping to get up to 350 hours. And you can say each week we're tracking it week by week. What are we doing? What's the assessment? Where's the services coming in? What do we do? Hey, this is a vacation week. People started going on vacation. They needed to. We sent people away, and we eventually built up to the point where now I track it on a monthly basis. And in the month of March, I hit 4,000 hours of bill services. Normally in March, we'd be hit between 5,000 and 6,000 hours of billable services. The blue markers there is how much we're doing in person. The orange is all the virtual services that we're providing. The tough decision to send our staff home, to furlough them, and to build something correctly was a critical decision for our organization to be successful, where we're seeing the retention of families, we're seeing staff that are able to manage the telehealth services, and it's proven through the numbers, because you don't get numbers like this if people are not, if they're on the phone for 15 minutes or they're on a 15-minute session. So that the evidence is there. It's not back to where we need to, but that's part of the early intervention program. That, I'm going to back up for a second. Then we could open up the next phase, right? So that was the up until June, what we're concentrating on, just building out a telehealth service delivery.
Right.
From July to October, we started concentrating on how to get people back in person, right? So August, Amy probably remembers this well with the guidance that was coming out. What could you do in July? We could open up, and I was like, nope, we're not opening up. The childcare program, I brought my director back on and one other staff member, and I said, okay, you're gonna figure this out now. I'm gonna cover the costs for this investment for you to be able to figure out what the regulations are. We'll come back in August. We'll come back with a pilot classroom, and then we'll launch in September. And we did this similar thing with the day school, where we said, okay, we'll launch in September. And then what we also did with the early intervention program is said, absolutely, there are some cases where we cannot do the therapeutic intervention if it's not in person, especially around assessments to figure out what they needed. So we had to put in all the guidance, and the AAC was actually great in giving guidance on what to do with in-person services. And so they become kind of a staple for it. And then we used DESE, and DPH really didn't have much because we were deemed essential services. So it didn't really, we stopped, DPH never made me stop providing those services. At the same time, childcare is very important to me. And I don't know that you can build a childcare program that works without having infant toddler care. So I'm retrofitting my building, I'm building out space there, and we launched our infant and toddler program and licensed it in September. While this is all going on, right? Because I wanted to keep pushing forward on the childcare program. And I wanted to take the opportunity because so many other programs were closing. It's come at a financial deficit for me. I'm still losing money in that program, right? The investment money that I have is running out very quickly. And I'm going to have to make an assessment at some point in time. If I can't fill the program and I can't figure out the ratios correctly, and I can't, because I'm not going to run, I'm running a high quality program. So we have a 1-to-6 ratio, right, Amy? Nobody has a 1-to-6 ratio in preschool, right? But we get so many kids that don't qualify for IEPs, that have speech delays and have needs. It's the ratio that I have to run with. And that's still a little bit high for what we're trying to do, but that's our referral base, is our early intervention program. So it's a real struggle to try and figure out how to do this right. And I'm not sure that we're there yet, but we're continuing to push forward. Also at the same time, so where I'm at right now is you get through October, everything's up and running. I think I put it on the next slide. No, maybe I didn't include it. Wayne Gretzky has a quote that I say to my team. He said one time he's asked, what makes him so great? And I'm not a hockey fan or anything like that, but one of my board members used this during the whole COVID experience. And he said, and it really resonated with me. He says, I don't skate to where the puck is. I skate to where the puck is going. Yeah. Right. So as an organization, as a leader of an organization, even when you're in crisis and when everything's going on, you still got to figure out where that puck is going. Right. And you need to start to move the organization to get there before they're ready to get there. So right now we're looking at organizational restructure based upon everything that we learned through the pandemic of what I need to do within the organization. We're engaged in strategic planning. We're also engaged in this capacity building. Now, capacity building is usually what you do when you have a strategic plan to say, okay, how do you get there? We're doing it all at the same time. And then we're still working on the branding and the marketing piece of the organization. So this is the Woodbridge School. I thought I'd bring this in. This is a flyer that we just mailed out to 10,000 homes, trying to open up the open enrollment and saying, we're still moving forward with the Woodbridge. we're not calling for the Professional Center for Child Development, calling it the Woodbridge School, so we can market it to the end audience. Because when we go out to a fair and we talk and people know us as special, the Professional Center for Child Development, they say, no, thanks, I don't have a special needs child, I don't need you.
Right.
And we have to say, no, we have a childcare program and I have resources beyond what any other childcare program can offer you, because I have PhD level clinicians that if you need support can come in and help. So you should want to send your kid here. So we have to give it a different name. And so the Woodbridge School has its own website. And so that's feeding into a whole different branding marketing strategy that we're doing as an organization. And then this is part of the reorganization that we're doing, where I've identified a new mission statement. Instead of eliminating the barriers to child growth and development, we worked with our staff to come out and figure out something that Sandy Matawa would be proud of, because I think it fits on a t-shirt. We're nurturing the growth and potential of every child, right? And that allows us to open up a bigger umbrella. And then we had to look there and say, okay, really PCCD is the umbrella. And what a strong umbrella needs is a good administrative core function. So you have to look at, what do you need? We need strong accounting, financials. We need strong human resources support. We need strong fundraising, IT, facilities management, and marketing. The different boxes mean different things to me. Just like the green we're pretty good on, the other one's not so much, and we need to enhance it, but we don't have the financial infrastructure to invest in these areas yet. So some's done through contracting, some we just don't even, I don't have a marketing person on staff or contract, right? So that's like a strategic priority to get in place. Then each of the programs underneath can be labeled such, and then they can tap into the administration for additional supports. And so that's how I'm looking to restructure the organization to be successful. And that all happened in the pandemic, right? With everything else going on. And then my wife wonders why I'm tired every day. So that's a little bit of my story from the last year. There's a lot more to it, but I figure that's kind of the general overview.
Great, thanks, Chris. And those two great stories, two different stories too. That we're getting that high level support that we get from Amy's organization and Chris down in the rolling up his sleeves, no doubt. As a good Suffolk graduate does. So first, let me ask you if you guys have a reaction to each other, because I know your wheels are spinning from hearing about sort of different levels. Do you guys have questions or comments of each other?
I just think, to amplify what Chris said, nobody knew what they were doing. And, you can learn all you want in a MPA program. But then if you don't know, we had teachers who didn't have the family's contact information. We had directors unsure of, like, how do I make a decision? Who's going to back me up? One of my most vivid examples is as all these new regulations were coming out, right? People were like not touching anything. So imagine you have like a 3-month-old. There was a whole new policy for diapering. And it was like a 19-step. I've talked more about diapering in the month of March and April than I ever had. And at one point, if you follow the directions, there were no hands on the babies. And I was like, I think that we should keep a hand on the baby. But we were so worried about, and I think that when you look back, that fear and the insistence of still being there for families. And then we also saw a huge need, and I'm sure Chris can talk about, for like legal and HR and like, what am I liable for? And why is this not, so there were all these sectors that never kind of came into the day-to-day work. But when now that kind of like, let's open childcare, their only ask was, we need time. They didn't ask for money. They didn't ask, they asked for PPE, but like, they just didn't want to be surprised. It wasn't like, no, we're not going to do it. It's like, okay, we'll do it, but we need at least a week to set up so we can disinfect every toy we've ever, So I think that fear and anxiety and the decision-making, it's really hard to learn that in a class, and you need a circle of support to be able to help make those decisions, which I think Chris, and then as Chris said, like, going on, like, we got to build this, we got to keep going on. Because I think that's the other underlying anxiety is like, will suddenly a switch get turned and everyone thinks, oh, this will be open? We don't know.
Right.
Yeah, when we opened up our childcare program in the first week, we went through, I think it was 2 months of disinfectant.
Yeah.
And all the stuff could say, oh my gosh, I went out and hired a cleaner just to be able to clean. and moving on. Expenses I've never had before. The lawyer fees that I have, right? Just from laying people off and trying to figure out, it's not something we had. Ben, I had to bring in lawyers and help us to get it right. You know, and right now, the biggest concern I have is the mental health and well-being of my staff.
Right.
Right. There's hairline triggers that are going through the program. Something happens and people that wouldn't normally explode are exploding. Right. And you just sit there as a director and you go, okay, what's the straw that is actually going to break the camel's back? And people are just going to say, screw this field. It's nuts. Right. And I can go make more doing something else. That's a heck of a lot less stressful. And I think we're going to see it in the teaching profession, and we're going to see it in the early education profession. And that's a worry to me, because this is where you can make the greatest impact and change on a child's life. So that's why I choose to work in the early childhood arena, is that this is where you can make lifelong lasting impacts to a child. And so that's where we should be putting our resources and our best talents.
Chris, it's interesting you raise that, because I would guess that your staff is really patient and tolerant dealing with the severe medical needs of your clients. You know, they're tough, you know, but not, you know, but we'd still have that vulnerability. Rachel, you had a question?
Oh yeah, well, I kind of I used to work in early childhood education as an infant teacher and a preschool teacher, and kind of some early intervention experience. So thank you. This was like super interesting to me. I was just kind of looking at like what staffing looks like now. Speaking of that, you were just talking about that. I know, like for me, like I think Amy mentioned that a lot of people that work like live below the poverty level, and like that was a big thing for me, is that, you know, I would work 40 hours a week and I couldn't pay my bills. So I just didn't know how, you know, if the COVID pandemic has like made it harder to staff with lower enrollments, or what that looks like.
Yes, harder.
Yeah.
Harder. You can't find people, and they're making more on unemployment, quite frankly. And when you're paying poverty wages and then the unemployment pays above that, I can't blame them for staying home. I can't blame them one bit.
We're hearing like directors are setting up interviews, and then the director is sitting on Zoom because no one shows up for the job interview. I also know directors who are covering in classrooms, right? Who cannot, you know, because you need somebody. So yes, I think the recruitment and retention, and that's why we can't think of this federal money as one-time money. We can't say like, oh, for 6 months, you're going to get more money and then you're going to go back to normal. And I think policy-wise, like the governor's budget that he released kind of went back to normal. So I think this idea of like, we are not back to normal, people. And I think when the smaller programs can't stay open, that's when people are going to freak out and call their elected officials. And then we're going to say, we told you. It didn't seem like urgent, because we don't know the true demand yet. Right. Yeah. We don't know. We also know parents who have young kids sometimes would take their younger children closer to work. Now we're seeing maybe more need in local communities that might not have the capacity, because maybe a parent is working, you know, from home 3 days a week. Our funding is also like 5 days a week, 10 hours a day for public support. And that's just it's not going to work for families.
At 35 or 40 bucks a day.
Right.
That's not covering it. The other piece of it that I think came through light is within the childcare arena is just the difference in the funding mechanisms. Right. So when you have Head Start, you have a federal to local grant opportunity, and they kept all that funding in place. Right. And then you have your subsidized childcare programs, and then you have your private providers, and you have public schools. So in some regards, our public policy creates almost a segregated institution. Right. So the way I look at it is public schools is where you're going to see your special education kids. Head Start's where you're seeing your low income kids. Childcare is where you're going to see your low income working families. And then Bright Horizons, Little Sprouts, and other childcare providers, is where you see the others. You don't see commingling of economic statuses within childcare programs. And you think about the limited opportunities, and that's all set up by policy. Right, because it's where the funding is. It's how we've looked at funding for childcare programs.
It is interesting because it's education and human services, right? And so, you know, Amy, I wasn't really thinking about that and aware that, you know, you could be an EOHHS with my DMH students and, you know, and mass health people and whatever, but no, at some point you made the move out into the education secretariat. So is that a different silo, or is Well,
Right. So I think, right, I mean, as outsiders, right? So we are advocates. So we believe in the inside outside strategy. We want government to work, but we also feel like it created some other problems because, we're not equal in funding and status in respect to the other education. And sometimes we get pitted against each other kind of in policy and funding wise, oh, we did K to 12 this year, you guys hang on. Yeah. And I think that the structure, when we worked to create the department, there was no secretariat. So Governor Patrick created that, which created a new dynamic. So, so that's the other piece is like, careful what you wish for in legislation, careful what you think in governance. Some days I have governance remorse. But I think what this showed is you can't make a decision, because what we learned in our parent survey is parents with young children and who also had elementary school children were waiting to hear what K to 12 said before they made their childcare decision. Because if they were going to be home with their second grader, they weren't going to take their 1-year-old to a childcare program. So this dance of like, yeah, we kind of work together. It just became so clear at the local level. Like, we're working with superintendents now to better look at your landscape, because things like space, things like shared resources, things like technology, right? That all became high priority. And how do we balance and have assets in communities and work together? We saw it happen with school age staff. Like, a superintendent's like, I'm going to have to lay off these people, but do you need people? And then maybe we could fund that position in that, kind of things we never talked about for real before kind of happened organically.
Lauren.
Hi, Amy and Chris. Thank you so much for speaking. Chris, I actually think I met you a year and a half ago. I am from Andover, and I used to work for Senator DeZoglio. So I coordinated a visit.
Do we meet at Melmark? I think at Melmark, right?
I did, yes. So thank you for presenting. But I'm not sure if you guys, I think I kind of want more of an in-depth, answer, but I think after the pandemic started, obviously, the small line items or budget items that you kind of were advocating for within the state legislature, while, those incrementally helped your budget and your fundraising and gaining more traction with your students. I guess my question would be, how, and Chris being, coming to Melmark and then, obviously visiting the professional center, how has that shifted? Have you had to rely on private investors? Have you had to do different campaigns elsewhere? How has that kind of shifted, and how is, your fundraising going now, and how do you kind of see it going in the future?
So I would say for us, the PPP loan was a savior, right? When we secured the PPP loan, I brought everybody back to work and did that. Now, some of them got mad at me because they could have made more on unemployment, right? And if we had had better understanding of how long we could have used the PPP loan, instead of over 8 weeks, but over 24 weeks, we didn't find out that until the very end. Like, it could have changed our strategy a lot more to have a longer term impact. And we were fortunate in that we were in that boat. Some of my colleagues couldn't apply. They didn't meet the criteria, even though when it comes to the early intervention funding, the way it's set up, the state stepped in and gave some money to it, but they're doing it on the DPH number, which is, for me, that was 33% of my billing. So they weren't looking at any of the private insurance billing rates that were out there. And this is money that goes to save the Commonwealth funds over time. And I know I remember sitting in a session with, I think it was 3 representatives at the time, trying to explain to them why we needed some stabilization funds in early intervention, because whatever they're tacking on, it was a fraction of the cost. And they're thinking it's a great thing, and I think it's great, but it's a fraction of the cost, and they weren't seeing the whole picture. So for us, the PPP, and then we had to step it up on the fundraising. Like I said, one of my strategic priorities before the pandemic was to work on fundraising. I didn't have a grant writer, right? We hadn't taken time. And if you think about going to nonprofit work and grant writing, get a template narrative of all what you do. So you just grab information and plug it into a grant, push out your grants. We developed that all once we got the PPP, because I went out and hired some people to do that exact work and say, okay, I'm going to need additional funding in the future. That grant writing work has led to, I got a grant for $25K to buy new computers, and we're creating staff studios within our building for therapeutic visits. It's led to an initiative to create a telehealth kiosk in the city of Lawrence, where not only is the digital divide real, but a quiet space in order to receive therapeutic services is not available to you. So we're looking at buying this pod that maybe we can put in a library or another public area that families can rent out once they're open up, and they can have that quiet space to go to, and it'll be outfitted with a computer and just some outside the box thinking to say, this isn't going away. How do we do that? So the grant writing has done there. And then we've been working to increase our private donations as well, which has helped.
Thank you.
The only thing I would add from the state budget is we have often only advocated for the public side of the dollars, right? So if only 55,000 out of 244,000 are getting a subsidy, most in that the chart that I showed with the bars. So legislators are like, wait, let me get this straight. We're giving you this money, but it's only impacting. I felt like a little bit like a used car salesman. I'm like, yep, that's right, because we've only been advocating for the public side of the dollars, but it's a mostly private system. And even how you mix private dollars and can you support, I mean, we had people like shower curtains were separating entrances because parents couldn't come into the building. Like a shower curtain probably isn't going to cut it. So how do you fund facilities in a way that's going to facilitate in a private home that's a family childcare home? And many emergency places were family childcare homes, which brought a whole, so we were trying to kind of resolve many of the kind of structural problems that we had to start with, but then it became like, we got to do this tomorrow, and we need flexible dollars that's not counting like a kid or a parent income to make it happen. So I think it helped open up, like, this is what we're really funding and not, in Massachusetts.
The complexities of, well, I was just going to say the complexities of the multi-service delivery platforms in the early childhood. Everybody wants a very simplistic answer, right? They want to write the legislation in third grade. Early childhood is anything but simplistic, right? And it's meeting the family's working needs, but the way the regulations are cut up, the way the service delivery happens, it's very complex, which makes it very hard to navigate and manage and fund.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Chris, you've had design factors. You also had to think about design factors in your facilities, and now, okay, dividers and such. Well, Amy, I'm just kind of curious though, because the PPE money can go ahead and help Chris to revise, change around the facility. Small daycare providers, did they get like?
So one of the uncoverings was many family childcare providers didn't have business bank accounts. Right. So then we had this whole Goodwin Proctor, actually the law firm, stepped up with a whole pro bono line of helping people apply, like, this is what you need, we'll talk you through it. If you're running a program like Chris said, and you're doing all these things, and now you're filling out this bank loan that you've never, so I think there was also a lot of skepticism, like, how am I going to pay this back? And to Chris's point, like, I can bring people 8 weeks, but then what happens? So yes, one of the questions we've been asking is, who got the PPP? Like, what organizations, like, did the Patriot? No, we won't talk about the Patriots, but like there are organizations that got it that probably were savvier. And this is it's kind of the cultural challenge, right? Like, if you're running a nonprofit, you might not have a strong business background, but you better. But I think we have learned now, whether you're a board. I mean, we watched programs go through 20 years of savings in 3 months. And when legislators heard that, they were like, wait a minute. Like, that's not like they're bad business people. There's been such structural deficits that just, it's the way that it is.
Right.
I had colleagues that applied for the PPP, and when it came out, the final regulations, they just didn't sign it. They gave it back after the first round because it all went so quickly. But then it started to become, okay, now they're going to come and get me for this. I don't want anything to do with that risk. I'm going to Ben and Grare it and not go through it. And they just didn't sign off on it.
Right. So Matt Durkin here.
Hi guys. So I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Durkin Foundation, which is up in Billerica MA3, so right over by you, Chris. And so I'm not too familiar with the grants, because typically a lot of our fundraise of our money is well, actually all of our money is all fundraising. And we actually did like fairly well considering the economic distress that people have been under this year. And I know that you were talking about that you tried to fundraise. I just was interested to see like what some of your fundraising strategies were during the COVID and before and after, or what would you hope to do after?
Yeah, I mean, we ran a virtual trot. We've been running the trot for Special Tots for, I guess we're coming up on 28 years now. And we made a real decision in July to say, okay, we'll run this virtually. We raised twice the amount of money that we normally raise. And we had more runners from across the country than ever before because of it. You know, and then it's just been asks, talking to people, right? Having that conversation and telling them this story and saying that then, you know, some of my donors are then writing us checks, right? From that, because they want to see us succeed and they want to see it. So that's mainly been our energy and effort. But we were fortunate. We were supposed to run a gala and I had chosen not to run it in 2020. And if you know fundraising, gala is like the mecca of what you do. We just didn't have the pyramid base of fundraising underneath it, right? So I felt like we were spending a lot of time and energy on a big event that's great and public facing to break even. And that wasn't where, so I said, let's stop for a second. Let's not continue the insanity. Let's pause that and let's figure out what we want to do. So I didn't have to worry about my colleagues that had put down deposits on, you know, space and food and banquet costs and all that stuff that they lost their shirts if they didn't take out insurance on it. But grants is a big piece of what we're doing right now. And then it's the knowing who your individual donor bases are and then cultivating those relationships and stewarding them so that they support. So when you call up and have that ask, they know your story, they know your narrative, they know what you're doing, and they want to give you.
And we saw an early education funders collaborative result over the last year. So it's not a pooled fund, it's foundations across the state. But so I think that it's been inspiring to see philanthropy. But this tension of like, what should philanthropy be funding? What is a government responsibility continues. We also kind of nationally had a discussion of like, should we be saving all programs? Are they all, I mean, which was silly, right? Because people were,
Right.
but will they come back and who gets to decide? So, you know, being clear about what we're talking about and what families are going to want to need and how they're making decisions. When you look back, the day-to-day operations of what people were trying to do would have been impossible to sustain. So I think without the federal dollars stepping in, we would have had a lot bigger problems to be solving right now.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So, you know, one of the big themes in this class has come up quite a few weeks is looking at collaborative public management, the sort of network management. And, you know, Chris, it sounds like, you know, you're good at pulling into what you can do, not necessarily on your own. I'll be curious about your other partners, what other partners you've involved. But Amy, that's been central to what you talked about. You know, that you kind of moved. The advocacy was less urgent, but it looks like networking was really urgent. And so I'm kind of curious how that worked. It sounds like you were coordinating different kinds of services to get themselves together to help one another out. Was the platform for that like those 9:30 meetings? Like, this organization says, we got this need. Okay, let's get you all together. Is that how that worked or started?
It did. And it was the strength of the community, right? So it was like every morning logging in and seeing everybody. It was also demystifying some of the opportunities that might be out there. Like, we'll help you through it. Don't worry about this. Understanding. I mean, people, I think over the last 4 years became more interested in government. But me telling you to advocate for 13 different line items that don't affect you was like, okay, Amy, thumbs up. You know, but we need this money to save your program. It became much more real.
Yeah.
And I think we saw these. The other thing I'll say is we discovered people who would never show up in an org chart, but that were running either in a community or in a program that stepped up. You know, we had one early ed coordinator in a public school system who got a seat at the superintendent's leadership table because she said, like, you need me. I'm driving around with hotspots to see how families are accessing internet. So, and we created these kind of smaller communities where people could come together and realize that kind of a power. And so, yes, that for me has been the most inspiring for people who never thought maybe to look beyond the walls of their program to see where they can play their role in their community was paramount. So I think getting things done. And I just have to say the accurate information, like the misinformation just spreads like wildfire, and people spend so much time and it's frustrating and it's anxiety producing. So be able to say like, that is not true. This is what the real story is, and here's the resources where to find it. I'll give you a quick example. We had somebody on the 930 call said that she heard about a family that didn't send their child back to school because there's a pandemic EBT card with benefits for food. And if the kid went back to school, they were going to lose that because now the kid was going to school where they were getting food.
Wow.
On the 930 call, somebody called Ayanna Pressley's office. Somebody called Senator Warren's office. The next day, Ayanna Pressley's office called me to say, we heard this happen on your call. We're getting you the accurate information from the USDA, and the Congresswoman can put out a statement if you want. Right. So, and that, if we had tried to solve that problem in the olden days, we would have planned a meeting. I would have said, I'm not an expert in pandemic EBT. Who is? What's your calendar like? Can we meet in Boston? What about Western Mass? So to see the power of people willing to step up and use their own power, and then have a place the next day to say, because then we heard 3 more stories. Oh, this family doesn't want to send their kid back because they're afraid about catching COVID in the cafeteria. You know, like people had never thought about why these reasons would exist, but to have a community that you trust, that has been there and is connected. And we talk a lot about these assets that people take for granted, like, oh, I live next to my legislator, or, oh, I went to school with that person. Just to see it activated, you know, it was pretty powerful.
Yeah, it's good. It's very cool.
I'd say there's no way you survive the pandemic without a strong network around you, right? And one is, in your positions, always do networking. If you get a chance to have a cup of coffee, have a cup of coffee, right? You never know how that relationship's going to come into play down the road. And then within your organizations, understanding the power of the associations that you're with. One of the most powerful associations that I work with is MAPS, which I happen to have worked for, but I now sit on not only the board, but the executive team. And they hosted weekly conference calls with everybody. We picked up the entire legal fees for all of the members that were associated with it, because we said we're fighting on the same issue. MAPS, as the trade association, just picked up that, and it was not, I mean, you're talking a couple $100,000 in fees to keep our tuition rates there, to keep our businesses open. And but it was the constant information that they shared. It was the panels, whether it was on vaccines and the information about vaccines, so we could spread that information within our programs collectively, to, hey, this is when the stuff was really going down, this is what we're hearing, right? And just that constant flow of information, so it was accurate. I couldn't do my job without it, right? Because I had to figure out where the hotspots that I absolutely have to pay attention to, and what can I ignore right now. And I couldn't do that without, and the power is Zoom. And the ability to do that without having to be in person was like, it was just amazing. So I go, what would happen if this pandemic had hit 10 years ago? Where would we have been as an organization?
Well, Chris, this got me curious.
Each other.
Right. Well, Chris, you got me curious. You had those computers that were paperweights back in late 2019. So, but people figured out how to do Zoom on those, I guess, especially for the telehealth thing, right?
But
so
not only that,
you
Teams,
gain that
Microsoft Teams. We've changed how we do our whole filing system and paperless, and we moved it from an organization that didn't. I spent $25,000 a year on paper, right? We moved a lot of paper, and that's not including the filing cabinets that I have and the offsite storage that I have. Like, we are paper heavy. We don't know how to do that, and we moved completely paperless, which was one of my strategic objectives. And Teams has transformed our ability to do that. Now I see the organization start to gravitate back to what we were pre-pandemic. And it's like, oh, no, we need to keep moving forward with this initiative. Don't go back to old habits. We need to keep forming the new ones because they're more efficient, effective.
That's great. Well, I think we're getting down there where I think one bigger question is what you guys are seeing for once end of 2021, what you're seeing in the services coming forward. But Amy, part of that is I'm really curious about a change that you've mentioned, just that it's clear. Daycare is low funded, and it's hand to mouth.
Child care. Stop saying daycare.
I blew it, didn't I? Child care. I beg your pardon.
So, did you?
Yeah, you warned me at the start. There I fall right into it. Yeah, but so it's hand to mouth, and it's you know, you really do, the margin is low, so it's that funding, you know, just on the payments that parents are making, usually. So, but you mentioned this change that it become more of a public service as opposed to just this fee funded service. Can you talk? I guess that's part of the future that I'd be curious from you, but what else you see for the future?
I think, you know, I think when I, as a practitioner, kind of moving to the advocacy space, I'm like, well, once everyone knows how important the first 5 years are, then we're
Right.
going to get money. And the
Right.
brain research has come. And I think we also, for a long time, relied on business leaders and like the political cognoscente to just say, like, this is important. Now employers are like, wait a minute, I want people to come back to my office. Like, we need, hey, we need childcare. So I think, you know, we're hearing now it's childcare is infrastructure, like bridges, like roads. So this idea of public good, like that we should only have public dollars go once a child turns 5, is just, it's bananas. But it's like, so I think it's reframing the way we think about it. It's not a personal responsibility. Like we don't think of it, so reframing it, but we have to help leading that conversation. And then these networks and alliances, you know, like how are you working in your community? If you're a superintendent, you should care about kids birth through 5, even if you never serve them, but they're coming. So there's no magic spell that happens when you turn 5. We've seen it with full day kindergarten, right? Once parents had it, it's hard to take it away. And we see the
Yeah.
same, we saw the pre-K. I think, you know, infants and toddlers, I don't know many young parents or parents of young children that have like $20,000 laying around to spend on childcare. So
Right.
I think what we've learned is parents can't do it by themselves. There's no way. And I think, especially in Massachusetts, we have elected officials that are willing to stand up, to think differently, to, you know, to, in my lifetime, did I think we'd get $50 billion for childcare in this country? I didn't. But it's too important not to do it now. So I think this idea of infrastructure, and the savings that we'll spend, you know, that, and I used to say we shouldn't have to prove that we'll save money to get money, but you can't argue the research. So I think the awareness, and it took an emergency to do it, to that people see how important it is. I was very struck when parents were worried about their social emotional development of young children, that we learned in our parent survey, because I don't think we often have those conversations. You know, parents are like, I gotta get to work, can you please help me potty train, right? But for parents to be thoughtful and really worried about that, I think really has turned the corner. And I think I think we have to go to public. I think that it also lifted the curtain of the money that is, you know, that we lost as an economy, that we'll need to regain, will help us in these arguments.
Yeah.
Hey, Amy, did you give a plug for the commonstartma.org website yet?
Not yet, but that's the
If
group
not, we should
working.
probably.
Yeah.
I know I'm involved in the Northeast chapter
Oh, good.
with that, and I think I'm a
Common
convener for
Start.
the area.
It's Common Start. We can send it to you, Brenda. It's the folks who really spearheaded the work on paid family leave, $15 minimum wage. Really, you know, the next kind of chapter of that work has been this universal childcare access, and we have
Yeah.
seen strong legislative support. You know, and we have seen you know, the numbers that aren't scaring people. We used to like whisper and like, please give us $5 million. Now we're going for the big money. So yeah, so Common Start would be another way to just stay involved and active. And I can't leave without saying that you have to know who represents you, and you have to build a relationship with that person. And so you go to wheredoivote.ma.org and or .com, and I just think they just can't hear from people who rely on childcare. We have to think of it as a public good. So I
Right.
put my email in, so please stay in touch.
Yeah, that's great. Great. We'll hope to bring you back. Yeah. Chris, any thoughts on the future?
I hope the pandemic ends soon.
Yeah.
I'm tired. My wife is tired. She's a teacher. My kids, I'm thankful that they're not early childhood age. They're 12 and 9, and you know, my daughter can get herself onto the computer, but I see the mental health and the wear and tear on them, and they've been fortunate to be in person for most of their schooling with their public school and how it's worked. With my one daughter going to outdoor school, mean, if you tell me she's this week, she's at she goes to a tree farm in West Newbury every other week. 1 week she's in the building, one she's not. I'm happy. I don't care that they went sledding during the day. She's not home and she's getting social interaction with other kids. So I hope that the pandemic ends sometime soon. We can get back to the social interaction, but I'm also very nervous about what the future is, the impact. For billing and early intervention was down 42% through the end of January or February. That means that a significant number of kids that are young are not getting the intervention services. And that's a chunk of kids that are coming up through the system that are going to need extra supports and extra needs. And there's already a workforce that is extremely tired. And I worry about how many early retirements are coming and all that experience leaving the community, that it's going to have a long lasting impact. So our public policy needs to start to think that way, and our funding sources need to think that way too.
Yeah. Well, great. Thanks so much for this. I think you got our questions out and definitely gave us a lot of great answers and showed a couple good angles on our own futures and good professions. So we appreciate that very much, folks. Let's give them that hand for coming in. Woohoo! Yeah.
Just a note, as you're thinking about your next steps, you should ask organizations, how did you respond to COVID, or what did you learn in the pandemic? Because I think we also learned a lot about organizations and their and leadership. And I think it would be good, as you're thinking about this, or even going back to your own organization, asking those questions would give you an insight on how they deal kind of in good times to see how we deal in bad.
Good point. Hopefully we won't be interviewing just on Zoom. We'll actually sit down with employers and in those places. Just think of not actually seeing your workplace. And interesting. We'll super. Really glad to bring you guys in this evening.
Thank you.
And catch back up with you. Keep on keeping on. All right, students. I think that's it for us too. It's been great being with the 35 of you this semester this way. I do look forward to seeing you live in person in the fall as well. Look forward to your papers at the end of the semester 2 weeks from now as well. But yeah, we're closing out the class too. I'll stick on with Chris and Amy and anybody who's wants to say goodbye on the way out, but thanks for a good evening.
Thank you. Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you.
Recording.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.